The second reading from this week is Thomas Aquinas. So you may be wondering, who is Thomas Aquinas? Here's a nice picture of Thomas. He was born in 1225 and he died in 1274. Here's another iconic picture of him. He was a Dominican friar who taught theology at the University of Paris. Much of his work was focused on reconciling Christian dogma with the works of Aristotle. So, effectively what happened is that Plato's works always existed in the ancient world and in the medieval world, but Aristotle's works were found much later. And when they were found, there became an industry of trying to reconcile Aristotle's works with Christianity. And Thomas Aquinas was right in the middle of all of this. His philosophical method is to search out the best arguments on both sides of an issue, and then to look for a solution that combines the best of both sides. So in his first article that we're going to look at, it's called Whether the Existence of God is Self-Evident. Now, the setup, Aquinas begins our reading by presenting an objection to St. Anselm's ontological argument. In order to do this, however, he needs to clearly state what the argument is. Now, Aquinas is a very good philosopher, and that's why he starts by clearly stating what the argument is that he's objecting to. This is something that we're going to do in our own papers, and we should learn moving forward. So this is what's happening in Objection Two of the first article. So let's look at the text. But as soon as the signification of the word God is understood, it's at once seen that God exists. For by this word is signified that thing than which nothing greater can be conceived. Okay, so from this, we of course get the first premise of Aquinas' version of the ontological argument. By God we mean that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Back to the text. But as soon as the signification of the word God is understood, it's at once seen that God exists. For by this word is signified that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But that which exists actually and mentally is greater than that which exists only mentally. Therefore, since, as soon as the word God is understood, it exists mentally, it also follows that it exists actually. Therefore, the proposition God exists is self-evident. So, if we carry this argument out, premise 1, by God we mean that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Premise 2, as soon as we understand the word God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, this understanding of God exists mentally in our mind. Premise 3, that which exists actually and mentally is greater than that which exists only mentally. So, as soon as God exists in us mentally, then he also exists actually. So the proposition God exists is self-evident. Now, just to review, let's look at Anselm's version of the ontological argument again. God is something than which nothing greater can be conceived. When we understand something, that thing exists in our understanding. So, God is something than which nothing greater can be conceived, exists in our understanding. But, if God really is something than which nothing greater can be conceived, then God must not only exist in our understanding, but he must also exist in reality. Because if God didn't also exist in reality, there'd be something greater, namely the being that existed both in our understanding and in reality. And this is a contradiction. So God exists both in our understanding and in reality. Now, you may wonder if these two arguments are the same. I think that for this class, we should just consider them to be similar enough that the differences don't matter all that much. Now, of course, there are differences, and those might matter sometimes, but I think for what we are up to, we can understand the arguments as being effectively the same. And my hope is that maybe seeing the Aquinas' take on the argument has helped clarify how Anselm's argument works. Okay, now let's look at Aquinas' objection to this argument. Perhaps not everyone who hears this word, God, understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought, seeing that some have believed God to be a body. Yet granted that everyone understands that by the word God is signified something than which nothing greater can be thought, nevertheless, it does not therefore follow that he understands that what the word signifies exists actually, but only that it exists mentally. Nor can it be argued that it actually exists, unless it be admitted that there actually exists something than which nothing greater can be thought. And this precisely is not admitted by those who hold that God does not exist. Now, it may be surprising, I'm not sure if you can hear the train in the background. If you can, I apologize. Now, it may be surprising that there's actually 3 different objections in this paragraph. I'm going to go through them one by one, and it's going to give us 3 different ways we can object to Anselm's argument. Objection 1. The definition of God. Perhaps not everyone who hears the word God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought, seeing that some have believed God to be a body. Okay, so when you object to an argument, you need to object to one of the premises, and we see Aquinas here objecting to the first premise. So, Anselm defines God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And how this objection works is that Aquinas says, look, why do we have to define that God that way? Right? There are other ways to define God. And why do we have to use your definition, Anselm? Now, objection 2. Yet, granted that everyone understands that by this word God is signified something than which nothing greater can be thought, nevertheless, it does not therefore follow that he understands that what the word signifies exists actually, but only that it exists mentally. Now, I think that this objection is objecting to the distinction between understanding and reality. This is the 4th premise here. So, how this objection works? I can understand that the word God signifies that than which nothing greater can be conceived, but it doesn't follow from this that I understand that what the word signifies actually exists. This is because I can understand, or have in my understanding, both things that exist only mentally and those that exist mentally and actually. And there's no reason to believe that something can move from one category to the other. Okay? Now, this may be one of the things that makes you uncomfortable about this argument, right? You may think like, yeah, okay, I can imagine thinking in my mind that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, but why or how can we move from that understanding to reality? That's what Aquinas is objecting to here. Okay, the 3rd objection, what I call the circularity objection. Nor can it be argued that it actually exists unless it be admitted that there actually exists something than which nothing greater can be thought. And this precisely is not admitted by those who hold that God does not exist. All right, so this argument is saying that the ontological argument only works if we admit that there exists something than which nothing greater can be conceived, but this precisely is not admitted by those who hold that God doesn't exist. So the ontological argument doesn't work. So basically, what makes this argument circular, right? If we remember circularity from last week, circularity is when your conclusion is in one of your premises. So the claim here by Aquinas is that the conclusion that God exists is just in the first premise, right? That God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. All right, so there may be some questions. Feel free to ask them. And I hope that this video helped clarify Aquinas' objection to Anselm.